Well, hello everyone, and happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Here we are on Friday, and I've been taking Fridays to do a little bit of responding to the critics. We're currently involved in an examination and response to Dr. Kenneth Gentry's book, Have We Missed the Second Coming? Now, obviously I'm not going to try to answer every single false argument that Dr. Gentry has in his book. That would mean that I would have to have a series as long as my series on 1 Corinthians 15, to be honest about it, because the book is just rife with error, improper hermeneutical application, failure of exegesis, and logical fallacies. And I mean no disrespect in that. So what I'm going to do is to hit on some things that Dr. Gentry himself says are key points that he himself emphasizes. So, Dr. Gentry says on page 53, Luke 21:22 is undoubtedly the, and he puts that in caps for emphasis, not caps, but italics, for emphasis, undoubtedly the key verse that hyper-preterists use in promoting their unique understanding of the Bible, theology, and Christianity. In its context, it reads as following, and he quotes Luke 21:20 through 22. Now watch this. Inarguably, the context here is focusing on AD 70, as even dispensationalists agree. Now notice what he says. And we certainly can see why the hyper-preterists attempt to use this text as a basis for their new theology. Now, he goes ahead to say, hyper-preterists wrongly interpret this statement, and he says, they hold, therefore, based on this text, that no prophecy remains unfulfilled. But if that were true, he says, this would mean that prophecies regarding the resurrection of all men, the second coming, and more came to pass in AD 70. Yes, that's exactly what that would mean. Now, what's amazing to me is how Dr. Gentry attempts to respond to Luke 21. Now remember, he says, we can certainly see why the preterists would appeal to this passage, because it certainly sounds like it supports their theology. Now, his response to this is that we must understand that context shows that this all things refers to the judgment prophecies regarding Jerusalem's destruction. That's point number one. Number two, he argues that the word all does not necessarily entail an all-inclusive universal. And he appeals to Matthew chapter 3. All Jerusalem went out to be baptized of John. Look, folks, here's a hermeneutical fallacy. You cannot use one passage to negate another. While consistency of language certainly is a valid thing, all right, to go to one text, i.e. Luke 21:22, where it uses the word all, and then to run to another passage that is clearly limited in scope, and to say, see, we've got a passage over here that limits the meaning of all, therefore that means the word all in Luke 21 is talking about a totally different thing. It has to be limited as well. Upon what hermeneutical principle? That's an illegitimate transfer of context. That is a hermeneutical failure. So, Dr. Gentry's argument on all is a hermeneutical failure. It's a fallacy. Point number three, he then says, the particular absurdity. He said, on the hyper-preterist exegesis, Christ's statement would be erroneous to the point of absurdity. Are all prophecies fulfilled in AD 70? What about the virgin birth, Christ's crucifixion, his resurrection? After all, also appearing in Luke's gospel is the Lord's statement regarding his crucifixion, which occurred long before AD 70. I just have to tell you, this is a horrible argument. Dr. Gentry knows, believe me, he knows that preterists are not saying that AD 70 was the time at which all prophecy was fulfilled, meaning that no prophecy was filled prior to that time. No preterist takes that position. This truly is an argument ad absurdum. But it's a straw man. Let me reiterate. No preterist says, well, the virgin birth was fulfilled in AD 70. No. We believe that the process of fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy began with John the Baptizer. Luke 16:16. The law and the prophets prophesied until John. We believe that process of fulfillment took place, therefore, during the ministry of John, during the ministry of Jesus, including his virgin birth, his incarnation, his crucifixion, his resurrection. It is a process of fulfillment that climaxed and consummated in AD 70, when all prophecy was fulfilled. That is to say, all prophecy that had not yet been fulfilled was then fulfilled. It's absolutely horrific for Dr. Gentry to build that kind of a straw man and to say, look at this horrible, absurd position of the preterist, when preterists do not believe that. That's really quite irresponsible argumentation. And then finally, he says we must take note of the particular grammar. Note that Jesus speaks of, quote, all things which are written. And I got to tell you, when I very first read this argument, I was flabbergasted, just like the previous argument. I could not believe that a man of Gentry's erudition would actually make such an argument. He says, note that Jesus speaks of all things which are written. He does this by employing a perfect passive participle, gigramene, having been written. Now watch this. This refers to prophecies already written when he speaks in AD 30. Yet we know that more prophecies arise later in the New Testament. Thus, Jesus is referring to all things written in the Old Testament. At this stage of redemptive history, those are the only prophecies that had already been written. That is really bad. I could use a lot of other adjectives. Let's take Dr. Gentry's argument. When Jesus said, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled, he is speaking that AD 70 was the time in which all Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled. Well, my response to that initially would be, thank you very much, Dr. Gentry, you just became a full preterist. Why is that? Point number one, there are no New Testament prophecies. The coming of the Lord, foretold in the New Testament, is drawn from the Old Testament. The judgment and the resurrection, foretold in the New Testament, are based upon Moses, the law, and the prophets. You know, those things that had already been written in the Old Testament. Point number three, Dr. Gentry says that what Jesus is saying, therefore, is that all Old Covenant, Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled by AD 70. Once again, I say amen and amen. You know why? Well, let me reiterate. The doctrine of the judgment, the coming of the Lord, and the resurrection of the dead are from those things which had already been written when Jesus spoke. Paul said his doctrine of the resurrection, where did he get it? Well, let's see. Isaiah 24 through 27, Hosea 13, Daniel chapter 12, Ezekiel 37. That's where the doctrine of the resurrection came from. So here's what we have Dr. Gentry saying. AD 70 is the time in which all Old Covenant prophecies were fulfilled. But the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, the just and the unjust, was an Old Covenant prophecy that had already been written when Jesus spoke in AD 30. Therefore, the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, which is the New Testament doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, was fulfilled in AD 70 according to Dr. Kenneth Gentry himself. So let me say again, thank you, Dr. Gentry. Amen and amen. You see, what Gentry has done here is simply tried to divorce New Testament eschatology from Old Covenant eschatology. He has made straw man arguments. He has made fallacious, logically flawed arguments. And then he has surrendered his own eschatology when he says all Old Testament prophecy would be fulfilled in AD 70. Well, that's enough for today. That really is enough, to be honest about it, to completely, totally refute the entirety of this book. Have we missed the second coming? Well, Dr. Gentry, by admitting that all Old Testament prophecy was in AD 70, that means you did, in fact, miss the second coming. Thanks again for joining me. Have a fantastic weekend. Lord willing, we'll see you on Monday.